Before we begin our descent into Doom mode, let's point out that any of these planned, possible, probable changes for the game, as pointed out by the lead game designer Addons Issue himself, are not planned for 11.1.7 or for even 11.2, so basically not for this expansion, so nothing that we are mentioning right now you will get to see this expansion. Maybe we will get to see, for example, for the last patch or the pre-patch for the next expansion, some of the early changes and then more of them with the beginning of the next expansion. So we had yet another interview from Addons Issue talking about their plans for the game, and this time it was again centered around the fight, the ongoing Cold War between Blizzard developers and Addon developers for this game. This is something that has been going on for quite a few months already. It had been for some time repeated by Blizzard devs, but without really much action. You know, it sort of sounded like some political candidate promise for the future that never happened for many years. And then just recently, for example, before this patch, before the Undermine patch, we did have the devs pointing out that they want to start clawing back on some of the functionality of the addons. They want to start thinking about stopping some of the addon functionalities, and that would have only been the first few steps towards what is the final solution for Blizzard. The ultimate end for the story is that at the very end, eventually these addons will be killed off completely. They will be removed completely because most of their functionality is now baseline, default in the game. As they were pointing out their plans, the built-in functionality including things like damage meters, customizable additions to the new cooldown manager, better nameplates and audio cues, as well as buff and debuff tracking, raid encounter boss timeline, and then you stop addons from being able to access the combat log and the combat log events. Their idea was always the same. It wasn't that we want to make your experience worse, because right now, if you read this, you're like, wait, but I don't want to play my game without my Weakauras. I don't want to play my game without my, cooldown trackers. That would make the game harder, and that is what they were trying to point out. We don't want to make the game easier or harder, we want to keep the game practically just as hard as it is now. Our goal is to make it simply less complex. The goal is to build up our native functionality of our UI to then reduce the gap between players using the normal Blizzard UI versus the ones decked out in addons. Once we are most of the way there, then there's going to be that last mile, which will consist of things basically being removed for good. This means that in their plans, the end goal would mean that addons like deadly boss mods or bigwigs would be completely dead. The damage meter, like details for example, would also be completely dead. Weakauras, for the most part, would end up dying. Pretty much all of the Weakaura tracking, any kind of buffs, debuffs, cooldowns, those would all go away. Nameplate addons, things like Plater, customizing Plater in things like, for example, let's change the color of the nameplate of the dangerous mobs. That will go away. Let's change the cast bar of the cast that's very dangerous. That would also go away. Any kind of QOL Weakaura you might be using right now, like, the Undermine Weakaura for the raid, the War Within Season 2 pack for Mythic Plus, things like the Mythic Plus Auto Marker Weakaura, or the spell CDs on nameplates for Mythic Plus, all of these would go away. They would no longer be available once their plan is in full motion. Now, the most recent interview from PC Gamer had a few extra info on what they are planning to get rid of first. Basically, which addons, which things are on the chopping block in the near future. The first three ones mentioned are that the incoming heals will no longer be trackable. Now, to be fair, incoming healing is not been that relevant ever since the vanilla TBC, maybe even Wrath days. It's not something players keep too much track of. What was much more relevant was the point where they will no longer allow tracking of group abilities or other player abilities or cooldowns. So imagine you're raiding, you're using your ERT, you have all of your externals planned out, you can see which externals you have available. You can even use the system where you can click one of them, automatically send the whisper out. The other player will get the raid frame of the player who whispered to glow, with a warning to tell them to innervate that player, for example. That's also gone. Your cooldown tracker for Mythic Plus, for example, all of this you see here will be gone. All of these cooldowns right next to the players will be gone. Your interrupt tracker, your interrupt list would also be gone. And then the other point mentioned was that no tracking of specialized buffs or debuffs. This will include both the ones in the frames and also the ones in the nameplates. This would also no longer be trackable, so things trackable by plater, for example, or just your buffs and debuffs you can track in your frames would also not be allowed. The next one was the customization of nameplates. The conditional logics that you can use to change, like changing the color, adding glows and warnings and all things like that to your nameplates, will not longer be allowed. You can only change basically the size, the length, the font of your nameplates, and that's about it. And this comes, of course, with the promise of Blizzard of being able to improve the base UI, the new cooldown manager, the edit mode, another promise of being able to add better audio and visual clarity, and also better audio cues for different encounter mechanics, but also for different abilities. Now, this is supposedly, of course, coming with a plus. Blizzard is saying that, sure, we are going to be stopping you from tracking group abilities, from being able to track your interrupts, which is going to make, for example, a Mythic Plus key much harder, especially if you're not in voice comm, for example. And that's why he's making the example of, we are going to counter that with making the dungeons, the encounters easier. Because then it means we are now allowed to design dungeons with fewer interrupts being required. Dungeons which have less reliance on, for example, having to dodge with swirlies, having to dodge mechanics, because all of the difficulty of the interrupts is being more trivialized by having an interrupt, an interrupt list, an interrupt priority system, an interrupt Weakauras, etc., etc. So the explanation is that if we limit what you can organize with things like Weakauras, cooldown trackers, interrupt trackers in Mythic Plus, then we can design better dungeons, basically. Blizzard as a whole have made this point before, the fact that, for example, recently over the past few tiers in these expansions, they had to rely more and more on mechanics like swirlies, like balls and lines and beams and circles you have to dodge. Why? Because most of the other things they come up with are solved with a Weakauras. So they become pretty trivial to complete. So what can't you solve with a Weakauras? Dodge. Move your feet. That is a tried all the true mechanic that you can't really get help from a Weakauras. You see a bunch of swirlies on the ground and you have to dodge them. That's it. And you can see more and more of these in mechanics all over the place, because that's the only thing they are sure won't be trivialized by a Weakauras. Think about, for example, all the circles, the swirlies you have to dodge on Gallywix, right? Those are not really Weakauras reliant. You simply have to move your feet and run away from those circles. Now, what is the problem of all of this? Even for the original UI purists, even for the add-on haters who might enjoy these news about Blizzard's commitment to wanting to reduce the power of add-ons over time, the problem is that, of course, all of this comes under the idea that Blizzard will be able to rise to the occasion and actually do both things. Thing number one, be able to up their UI to be good enough to not make you miss the add-ons that will no longer work. And number two, the fact that they have to change the way raids mechanic are working, as well as dungeon mechanics are working, because of all the things they are planning to change, like not allowing you to track cooldowns and not allowing you to track interrupts, incoming damage, incoming casts coming to you, spell CDs on your nameplates, essentially making the dungeon, for example, feel much harder. So you have to adjust the dungeon for all of these things going away. And players have been, of course, a bit skeptical that all of this will actually end up being successful, especially because players already have gotten a taste, in fact, a couple of spoonfuls of flavor of what Blizzard has cooked so far. We have seen the edit mode, we have seen the cooldown manager, so we have seen what is Blizzard's first take on trying to create something that might resemble an add-on, right? And players are worried, of course. They are worried because these first takes are absolutely horrendous. They are terrible. The edit mode offers very, very poor customization. It's nowhere near the level of even just something like bartender to edit your buttons, let alone the cooldown manager. The first iteration of the cooldown manager is awful. You can't change anything about the cooldown manager. You can't change to just not see abilities you don't care about as part of the cooldown manager. You barely have any agency about said cooldown manager. So of course, when Blizzard tells you, don't worry, we are going to be able to put our own boss timeline, boss cooldowns instead of DBM or bigwigs, you're like, are they really going to be doing an even somewhat even job to the one of an add-on? We're getting rid of all of these useful Weakauras and useful customization of nameplates, for example. Are they going to be able to put them into their base UI, even at a reasonable level compared to what you will be losing from those add-ons? And what if it gets even worse? What if on top of the base UI not even being up to par to the add-ons you are gonna be losing, what if the supposed reworked dungeons and reworked raids to be in line with all these things you are losing, what if they will be significantly worse? What if they will be a complete failure? Maybe Blizzard will undercook them and they will practically have no mechanics and they will be a joke. Or maybe it will be the opposite, maybe they will be overcooked. Maybe Blizzard will take away functionality from your add-ons but then still release bosses and dungeons complicated enough that without your Weakauras, without your nameplate scripts, and without your CD trackers and interrupt trackers, those dungeons and raids will end up being insanely harder than what they are now. That is currently the generic fear players are having when they read these kind of promises for Blizzard in the future. Still trying to look at this positively, it could be good if they were true to their word and being able to reduce and remove things like the interrupt tracking, the cooldown tracking, and all of the complexity of Weakauras, warning you when something is targeting you, warning you when something lethal is targeting you. You remove all of these, but then you remove the amount of casts you have to interrupt, the amount of CC you have to layer on the Mythic Plus packs. Maybe you add fewer mobs, so Turbo AoE won't be nearly as relevant. You're gonna have more clarity in the dungeon because you're not fighting 15 mobs at a time, you're fighting 5. Maybe they will actually improve on their audio cues, make mechanics way more distinguishable. You can now actually see and understand what's happening because everything is way more clear. That could improve things. Definitely the biggest issue is going to still be, of course, the customization. No matter what they will deliver, it's very unlikely that any of the things they plan on putting as their default UI feature will go anywhere close the amount of flexibility you have on add-ons, whether it is Weakauras or Plater for your nameplates or your boss mods. Those kind of things you could customize however you wanted. You had tons of different profiles you could choose from. You could even make your own. Whereas this one now coming from the default UI, you can't really expect this to be that much open and free in customization compared to an actual add-on. So likely, no matter the case, you will still lose some of the flavor, some of your own style you wanted to put in your UI, We will have to see, because as we said, right now this is not planned for 11.2, so maybe at the very latest it will be for 11.3, which shouldn't even possibly happen this expansion. We might even jump straight into the next one, so we're still talking about several months away from any of this happening. What we can, I guess, wait for in the meantime is the actual improvements on what they already have released. So the cooldown manager and the edit mode, which are at the moment still, as we mentioned, very lacking. So it's time to start seeing, if you want to believe any of this will end up on a positive note, then those improvements are definitely much needed for both of these features. But for now though, we can stop here with a, positive outlook on this for the future, although possibly tending on full copium levels, that this will actually not end up in a complete disaster. But for this now, for today, we are now over. We can start saying our goodbyes for today by starting to thank everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, long pants, short pants, is it hot? Is it cold? I don't know. It's changing 3 times a day right now. Just toss a coin and guess.